I'm going to come at effective eco-criticisms with a bit of a stroll through the woods and an arboreal ambling preamble, I suppose you could call it. My talk is a little bit different from the previous talk in that it's very scripted, and a lot of what I'm saying is going to appear on the screen behind me. So an arboreal ambling through the woods, but I guess cut woods would be the best way to talk about it. You see, there's a section in Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which talks about a neatly stacked, this is a quotation, a neatly stacked quarter cord of fireplace logs manufactured of rolled and pressed paper. It is a typically Dillardian fun poke at modern America's desire for the natural, even in the moment of erasing it. On the wrapper of each log was printed in huge letters, Dillard continues, the beguiling slogan, the romance without the heartache. So there's no need to go out and chop the wood anymore. There it is in rolled paper logs. Except that it's not wood. It used to be wood. Given the sensitivity of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek as a narrative to seeing and to things unseen, I had expected and remained bothered that Dillard missed the opportunity to talk about the history of paper in these rolled paper logs, a history of plants gently swaying, of giant reaching arms and fingers fanning skyward, branches and leaves or needles that were the shelter of starlings, and every other manner of Shakespearean bird that Eugene Schieffelin introduced to America. Did you know there was a guy who introduced every single bird that Shakespeare mentioned as an invasive species into the United States? Every single bird in Shakespeare now lives in the United States. It is, I suppose, a minor criticism for a book that otherwise pays so much attention to the trees and their, quote, curious relationship to our present moment. And Dillard is acutely careful to help us see that the tree that stands mute and rigid as an obelisk secretly seethes, it splits, it sucks, it stretches. It heaves up tons and hurls them out in a green fringed fling. She tells us that water lifting up tree trunks, and this is a quotation, can climb 150 feet an hour. In full summer, a tree can and does have heave a ton of water every day. A big elm in a single season can make as many as 6 million leaves, wholly intricate without budging an inch. Shocking to think that such a thing, with all of that agency and history, can be cut down. British folk singer Leon Russellson, not to be confused with Leon Russell, wrote in similar horror of Britain's middle market tabloid, the Daily Mail. He wrote as follows, and I'd like to. I had nothing else to do last night.
Not to be cut down to size, often reduced to a nauseous juice, and dried up and flattened till ready for use, then covered with newsprint and lies. Because who do that to a tree, raising its head to the sky, rooted in centuries, telling tall tale, breathing a green lullaby.
Dillard's poking fun at the romance without heartache, firewood, made me think that she surely had something to say about the past of those pressed logs. And I thought of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, a thought string only strengthened when Dillard writes 2 pages after the firewood scene that the past inserts a finger into a slit in the present and pulls. That slit in the present interests me immensely. It's a slit that Gilman opens up, but not through an active verbal description. It is, I don't know, an affective slit. And it's something that we see beyond what Gilman actually narrates in a similar way to how we see 3D images in a movie when we don those funny black glasses. I can't talk slowly because I have to keep it within the time limit. I timed myself several times last night. I need to go at a fairly good speed. So a lot of it is up there behind me. I'm not sure what number we're on. I'm not supposed to be on. Yeah, okay. There are two theoretical aspects of affect that we need to make clear here. Firstly, there are corporeal dimensions, and secondly, there are temporal dimensions. I speed up when I put all the stuff up there because we can read along. On the former, we can say, as Brian Masumi does, that affect refers to the openness of a body to, for want of a better phrase, articulate matter. But, and this is a key point, affect is bodily and cognitive responses to that which is, quote, in excess of conscious states of perception. The wording here is from Patricia Clue from the Affect Studies Reader. On the matter of temporality, to borrow from Gregory Sigworth and Melissa Gregg, quote, affect always points to a future not quite in view in the present. But I wonder if it might not be more accurate to say that affect points to a present becoming that is not quite in view in the present. In such a formulation, we don't have to dispense with the past and entertain the rather difficult notion that the past is over, a point which Masumi references. It also allows us to discuss that slit in the present, Dillard describes, and how the past inserts a finger. It's a really sexual kind of image, but anyway, how the past inserts a finger into it and pulls. Her discussion of trees demands inclusion of affect theory approaches, and inclusion which I will continue for the rest of this talk through close references not to Dillard, but to her in many ways more subtle predecessor, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Literature obviously can prompt us to expand our circle of ethical inclusion, and one of the ways that it does this is by showing us, oops, can you see it? No, I mean, can you see it? One of the ways it does this is by showing us things that we can't so much see as feel. Part of my job as a professor is to help my students to see things that perhaps we understand and feel, but can't see, at least not without prompting or assistance. Often to prove to my students that we can look at things directly and not see them, I show them stereograms. Can you see the airplane? Don't worry. One of my favorite pieces of literature that really foregrounds vegetality in ways that really force us to see the horrors of the crimes we have done to plants and by implications the necessity for extending ethical consideration to them is the yellow wallpaper. Since many of you may not be familiar with the story, are you familiar with the story? Everybody? No? Okay, I see a head shaking. So then I'm going to give about a 2-minute review of the story, if that's okay. And don't worry if you can't see the airplane, you might see it later. Maybe not. It's an American story that was published in 1892. It's a first-person narrative of a young woman who is or seems to be suffering from some kind of postnatal depression. Her husband, John, has taken her to an old mansion, a colonial estate in the countryside for a summer rest cure for her nervous condition. She remains most of the time in the upstairs nursery. She describes the torn wallpaper, barred windows, metal rings in the walls, scratched and gouged and splintered floor, the fact that the bed is bolted to the floor, and the gate at the top of the stairs. We learn quickly that she's clearly or seems to be in some kind of patriarchal prison, that she is an unreliable narrator, neurotic, obsessive, and perhaps psychotic, experiencing breaks from reality. Despite her troubles, she describes John as a good man who means well, and she herself as unreasonable. She begins by obsessing on details of the room and is troubled by the wallpaper. She sees things that other people don't see. Like I saw that airplane. I think some of you may not have seen it, but I'm not sure if I'm psychotic or delusional. But anyway, we'll talk about that. She notes its sickly color and its yellow smell. More about that later. It's a bizarre image, but not nearly as bizarre as the moving patterns in the wallpaper. The narrator uses the second person, asks us to directly imagine a toadstool in joints and an interminable string of toadstools budding and sprouting in endless convolutions. There's the mushroom thing. Moments later, she tells us after pulling off some of the wallpaper that the waddling fungus growth just shrieks with derision. There are patches missing. I love that image of mushrooms shrieking. There are patches missing. The wallpaper appears to be tearing off in places. She describes how the wallpaper stains anyone or anything who touches it. She describes how the wallpaper appears to mutate the longer a person stays in the room. She becomes more and more obsessed with the designs of the wallpaper, comes to see a figure in the pattern. She begins to think there's a woman creeping on all fours behind the pattern. She feels the need to free the woman in the wallpaper, starts tearing shred after shred, and strip after strip from the wall. John returns home, finds her door locked. She refuses to unlock it. He gets the key and enters, finds her creeping around the room, rubbing against the wallpaper and shrieking, "I've got it out at last! In spite of you!" John faints. She continues creeping around the room. creeping over his body. Each time she passes it, the narrative ends with her believing that she has become the woman who has been trapped behind the yellow wallpaper. The end. That's the story. That's the story that we're talking about. Most readings or diagnoses of the story since the story appeared is that she's not well in her head. She is a woman driven crazy within an oppressive patriarchy, that the story is a searing condemnation of patriarchal medicine and women's deeply ambivalent victory at the end as she symbolically crawls over the man who is now prone on the floor. It's a feminist story that ultimately empowers the woman, damaged though she is, but there's far more going on here, far more that Gilman is showing us. The yellow wallpaper pushes its readers to feel beyond what is visible, both metaphorically and literally, at one and the same time calling into question what it means to see the unseen and what it means not to see it. Haunted by pasts that refuse to remain in the past, that finger in the slit of the present that defines the affective. The eco-Gothic dimensions of the story become more pronounced the deeper the reader peers in. At the center of the story is paper, and obviously it is in the visions that the narrator has from the paper that we get the plot. These visions and the plot they generate in turn reveal for readers things that might otherwise be unseen, including, most obviously, the subjugation of the narrator from the paper, the subjugation of the narrator under patriarchal authority. They reveal far more than this, however. Like the images in a 3D movie or a stereogram, there are things in this story that are immediately present before, but not easily visible to the reader, at least not in the same way that the narrator's suffering is. Indeed, the story exposes more than simply human relationships and histories that reside in the very paper itself. While exploring the explicitly entangled complexities of truncated agencies of nature and women in the yellow wallpaper, it becomes evident that this story pushes the reader to feel beyond the convenient anthropocentric and ecophobic notions of a vengeful nature toward a more balanced understanding of vegetal agency, perception or understanding of plants on their own terms. And it's in our continuing failure to do so, and in our continuing thwarting of the agency of the vegetal world, that the magnitude of eco-Gothic horror takes form in this story. There's definitely something going on with the past of this paper. It's very, very clear that Gilman offers paper that's stripped of its former agency as a living arboreal body. And that this paper is, as I will continue to show, is definitely agential. The history of the paper haunts the narrative. There's something, and it's agential, that's in the wallpaper and it needs decoding. Everything about the wallpaper speaks of what Don Keatley calls plant horror. Keatley explains that at its most basic, plant horror marks humans' dread of the wildness of vegetal nature, its untamability, its pointless excess, its uncontrollable growth. Matthew N. Civils proposes a similar idea, which he calls vegetal haunting, a condition in which plants, through their uncanny, alien, and seemingly transparent presence, serve as disturbing spatial temporal markers of human and environmental trauma, if only we could see it. The ability to see is always a partial ability, and there's much that we simply cannot see, no matter how hard we look. There are limits to what the human eye can see. Infrared and radio waves are beyond our perceptual limit, as is the ultraviolet spectrum for most people. Those of us who have seen the three-dimensional images, I should let it come in slowly. Oh, well. Just look at the top one. Tell me if you see. And the cool thing about it is that it's not a static image, it's actually swimming. And if your eyes go blurry enough, you'll see it swimming. It's really amazing. But anyway, for those of us who have seen the three-dimensional images of stereograms, it is baffling and frustrating to be faced with people who are unable to see such images. How do these people see those of us who can see such images? So I wonder how you look at me when I can see that shark. How many people do? Well, let's not go there. I mean, when you can see something that somebody else cannot, what are you? Hysterical? In need of psychiatric help? Also, what are we missing? And how accurate is our assessment of what we're missing? Gilman's story clearly and decisively shows, I hope you like this slide. Clearly and decisively shows a threatening plant agency. Matter may not be able to talk, but I don't have this in my speech, so I'm just going to move through it. The image is for you there. Matter may not be able to talk, but it is informational and self-organizing, to borrow a quote from Patricia Clue from the Affect Studies reader. I call it historied matter, which is a slight variation of Serenella Iovino's and Serpil Opperman's storied matter. Matter haunted by its history and inscribed with the narratives of its past. Matter's capacity for self-organization, its being informational, Clue explains, is central to the production of affect. When I read the yellow wallpaper, that's my son down there. Can you see the size of this tree?
Yeah.
I got him there, actually, just for perspective. It's a terrible thing to say, but anyway, I was going to use it in this. Just stand there, please. When I read the yellow wallpaper, I can't help but think of the forest around Vancouver where I grew up, the stumps in particular, many 4 meters across. They stud every bit of forested land in the Vancouver Lower Mainland. They remain hidden behind the pattern of trees that replaced the original forest. The trees in all of these forests are second growth and skinny compared with the stumps. The stumps, when I was a child, had and continue to have today the scars from the springboard notches that the men cut into the trees so that they could stand against the trunk and use the tree's leverage while cutting the long saws. And you can see them here. These are where they stood and they pulled the saws back and forth. And they're still, these stumps are still there. I've always wondered what must have been going through the minds of these men as they cut down these magnificent trees and produced the denuded landscape that kind of looks like the Lorax. It came out when I was 6. Seeing the forests of the Pacific Northwest that are no longer there is like looking into a stereogram. You see another dimension, something behind the pattern. You see where I'm going with this? That's not immediately visible. Clearly, however, the evolutionary return of the past to which Keatley and Civils speak is a different kind of historied matter, the genetic material of the trees having obviously been destroyed in the production of the paper in Gilman's story. Even so, evolutionary returns, because the narrator of the yellow wallpaper so deeply imagines life growing out of the dead paper, deserve sustained comment here. The life that the narrator of the yellow wallpaper feels is not genetic, any more than the history of the paper itself is genetically encoded. Even so, the life that it had before, the life that this thing had before it became paper, the history it lived, the stories it holds, the informational and self-organizing matter required decoding. Sequestered in the yellow wallpaper is a host of cultural and biological cues that the reader is compelled to decode. And indeed, the narrator offers images of some of these forces that are beyond human understanding, whether or not Gilman was aware of what she was doing. Forces that are multidimensional and complex. Two-dimensional readings won't work, any more than two-dimensional seeing won't work with a stereogram. If you didn't see the airplane or the shark, that's two-dimensionality. It's because we have problems looking at two-dimensional images in 3 dimensions. And there are reasons for that, but later. Yet two-dimensional readings of the isomorphic similarities between the images in the story can be seductive, perhaps even in some sense rewarding, yielding insights on image patterns and so forth, but nothing in the way of an understanding of the return of the past life that has been thwarted, the genetic passengers that have been killed, the histories and the futures ultimately destroyed and turned into paper. Moreover, if there's something in the paper that the reader simply does not see, something in the thwarting of the visual agency that the narrator is on some level alert to, that the reader is not, then perhaps it's reasonable to look at what sort of techniques the author uses to involve the reader in the story to experience and perceive as if being within the narrative itself. Feeling the Vegetal haunting and plant horror in this story obviously is much harder than seeing and describing their presence. What is surprising about critical essays on the yellow wallpaper is the absence of discussion about how the story attempts to make the reader truly experience and participate in the narrative. Feeling the paper in all of its dimensions means seeing the history that it has had. The afterlives of the forest here are the wallpaper and the diary. The afterlives of the wood are the other dimensional image behind the pattern of the stereogram, so to speak. These are what we're looking at in the yellow wallpaper. The reader is made to experience the seemingly hallucinatory vision of the stereogram that the wallpaper offers. And rather than walking away from this and discussing only what we can see directly, I'm suggesting that we take the time, as the story implores us to do, in its own phrase, to see behind the pattern, because so doing allows us to fully appreciate the breadth of Gilman's ethical visions. It's surprising, as I mentioned earlier, how, despite the centrality of paper in this story, there's no academic discussion of it. The word paper appears 22 times in the story, and the word wallpaper appears 12 times, with a total of 34 references to paper of some kind or another, mostly wallpaper, but also diary paper. Paper is the ambivalent space of the forest brought inside. The silence of the trees of the forest and the yellow wallpaper should not blind us to their histories and to their rights. Men have cut and killed and desecrated and exploited those trees, those genomic carrying cases. And it's reasonable to see these bodies haunting the house and the hapless narrator, not quite in the same way as a Venus flytrap threatens, but acting nevertheless. Seeing this allows us to understand that imprisoned with the narrator is an entire history of arboreal rape and abuse. In a sense, the narrator seems to become indistinguishable from the paper, not because she's mad, but because she sees differently, sees what others do not. And while she certainly does not see the arboreal history of the paper, nothing in the text would support this, we should. This is obviously in line with what readers do. We often see through characters and their behaviors what they themselves cannot see. What the reader does see, I mean, in addition to what is in the paper, however, is very telling. She says toward the end of the story, that outside everything is green instead of yellow. And one has to wonder what the relationship is between greenness of everything and the need to creep. Because the word creep appears a lot of times toward the end, creep all the way. If there wasn't so much creeping inside, it would be tempting to suggest that the narrator wants to be careful not to kill the green plants, and therefore you have to creep on the ground. There's nothing, however, to support this either. Yet, the question about yellowness must arise here. Why yellow? Why yellow wallpaper? Why mention yellow and green here, except to remind the reader that plants turn yellow when they die? Anyone who's ever left something on grass, like on a grass lawn, has seen, the stunted effects of human actions and how the plant becomes deformed, and after a few days it turns yellow and dies. Yellow is the image of thwarted vegetal life in this story. So powerful is this thwarted agency that it enlivens color itself, thrusting color beyond its proper evocative realm. Color is, after all, something that we see, like your shirt, I see. It's not something that we smell. Right? It's a queer description, to be sure, one that twists the mind like Milton's oxymorons, forcing the reader to contemplate the madness of a color transgressing its visual domain, not only in becoming, quote, a yellow smell, which it does in this story, but being a pattern that laughs and mocks. By the end of the story, John wants to chop down what is barring him from his wife, and he's crying for an axe. The axe is an image evocative of violence, and its primary use, of course, is to cut down trees. Yet there's a profound victory for the narrator at the end, if only we could feel it, could see beyond the prejudices that make us think she's crazy. The fact that the narrator comes out of the wallpaper, to use her own words, suggests that she's not walled in. And I'm just going to say a few things about walledness. This gains in significance when we consider that the walls are plastered with the remains of a life violently ended. Robert Pogue Harrison, in this fascinating book, Forests, The Shadow of Civilization, If he's correct in claiming that, quote, walls no less than writing define civilization and that they are the monuments of resistance against time, like writing itself, then the silent resistance, if not of the walls, then on them, is a resistance in part made visible by the shared subjugation to patriarchal power and violence between the wallpaper and the narrator. Equally visible is that the civilization defined within this story is one that has blood on its hands, perhaps pulp is a better word. The eco-Gothic, should I just admit the person? I guess, okay. Still not going. Thank you. The eco-Gothic taps into the oppression of women. I'm not sure this is going to come in. Should I admit that person too? Oh, there we go. I feel so powerful. The eco-Gothic taps into the oppression of women. I'm almost done, but about 20 more, just a little bit more. But it does so in this story through a return of the past that's not entirely visible. It's a history of vegetal agency in life and ethical rights that have been thwarted, and that literary readings can help to keep silent. Readings that require an insane woman, matter stripped of its narratives, and men resolutely in control. Reading for the aborted agencies and affect and looking for the obscured histories in the yellow wallpaper resists these. For the Pacific Northwest, and this is my conclusion, how did you do that? Yeah, I'm learning. For the Pacific Northwest forests, the life of the first growth forests is the historied matter behind the pattern of the second growth. To the narrator of the yellow wallpaper, the history and the previous life of the pages of the diary book is immediately established through her description of them as dead paper, horrid paper that seems to know things. It is in the eponymous wallpaper of the story, however, that the full implications of aborted arboreal agency takes full horrific form. Inseparable from the repressed and broken nature in this story is the repressed and broken woman who narrates it. The inverted mirror image of her lack of control over herself is the riotous flowers, the gnarly trees, the toadstools, budding and sprouting in endless convolutions that horrify as readily as a Venus flytrap or as triffids. She looks and sees things, sees not the beautiful, but the old, foul, bad, yellow things, and through her, the reader feels not the horrors of nature, but of the thwarted natural agencies and the abrogations of vegetal rights. The story evokes a response not of ecophobia proper, but rather a fear of nature's response to the human hand. Gilman challenges the reader to look hard at the continuing effects and affects of patriarchal violence, to stretch the senses to their limits, to see and feel metaphorically and literally the horrors. Moreover, if we assume that the narrator is psychotic because she sees things that others do not, then we do a disservice to all women, to forests, to the story, and to the very paper upon which the story is written. It is, after all, a story about paper, a vegetal narrative that demands attention to the ethical treatment of plants. At this point, I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention.